It is now my distinct honor to introduce this evening's keynote speaker, Shalini Gupta. Shalini is the co-founder and executive director of the Center for Earth, Energy, and Democracy. Shalini's extensive experience in the sustainability field includes her work with the Minnesota Climate Change Advisory Group, the Next Generation Energy Board, and her current work with the Minneapolis Environmental Advisory Commission that resulted in the promotion of sound environmental policy and environmental justice. She currently serves on the leadership bodies of the National Climate Justice Alliance and the Midwest Environmental Justice Network, working to promote equitable and sustainable policies at the community level and across the country. Please join me in welcoming Shalini.
Well, great, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. Well, my name is Shalini Gupta. I'm with the Center for Earth, Energy, and Democracy. We are an organization that is based here in Minneapolis. We work nationally on issues related to intersecting racial and economic justice into sustainability work. And I was very happy and grateful to be invited by AASHE here today. I was overjoyed to get the invitation because I think this is one of the most important things that needs to be done in terms of all of us that are working on sustainability issues to really start to come together and understand our different perspectives. And our organization is really focused on how do we start to develop new narratives around climate change. There's no, oops. Well, this is Microsoft. Let's try it again. Oh. The green button. Maybe, do you want to just control it from over there? All right, great. So, what we have all come here in these exciting few days together is to really think about our Earth, and there's no doubt that we are profoundly changing it. And I think what I want to challenge us today as we sort of wrap up this conference and sort of move on to the work we're going to be doing back in our home spaces and home cities is to really think about what are the different narratives that are out there on different environmental and energy issues. What is the story that gets told? Who gets to tell that story? And how does it start to infiltrate into the research we do, the hiring that happens at our institutions, the curriculum that gets developed, and the communities that we work with, that our students work with? So that's really what we're going to be exploring today. And I really think about this in terms of many of you are in the official academic work, but I think of even the work I do as an educator. We do have former academics that work at the Center for Earth, Energy, and Democracy doing research, trying to work outside of academia to really meet community needs. And I really think of the work we all do, and especially the work I do around education of policymakers, decision makers. So in terms of the narrative and education we start to develop for not only students, but policymakers and the communities, our families, each other, how we actually start to educate. So part of the narrative that I'm going to be talking about is sort of the current narrative that we talk about in terms of climate change, right? So here, this is a chart of the carbon dioxide that has been released in the past 200 years. So it goes all the way from 1850 to 2012. So carbon dioxide has a residency time, the story of carbon, right? Has a residency time of up to 100 years, up to 200 years. And so the carbon that was emitted when the first Model T was coming off the line, or the millionth Model T, I'm sorry, was coming off the line in 1915, is still in our atmosphere today. 100 years ago. It was here in 1930. It saw world wars end in 1945. It saw the fall of empires. It saw the release of Prince's 1999 song, and it saw Roger Federer lose the US Open. And so that carbon has been around with us for the past 100 years and is still with us today. And how we think about the next 100 years and the future of sustainability, as I know many of you have been sort of grappling with these past few days, is the way we got here today, the pollution and the emissions that we've made today are going to be here in the year 2115, 100 years from now. And so what we have is a case where our actions today are going to have a direct impact 7 generations from now. And that carbon is going to be added and accumulating in our atmosphere. Now, the dominant story, the dominant narrative around climate change, as many of you know, is one around fossil fuels, right? We talk about it. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with this chart that looks at the history of energy consumption in the United States. So it goes all the way back to the late 18th century up to 2012. And you can tell for the first part, we were using mostly wood, and then we started using coal around the 1860s, then the advent of petroleum at the end of the 19th century, and then we had natural gas and nuclear sort of post-World War II. Renewables actually playing a very small percentage, growing hopefully, but a very small percentage. Now this narrative of climate change, of the carbon pollution that's been in our atmosphere, is the story that many of us have been sharing, and it is a technological sort of narrative around climate change, that the problem has been because of our fossil fuel consumption, which is true scientifically, that is absolutely true. I would argue that there are other stories as well associated with this, because if we have just a technological sort of narrative to what climate change is, the solutions that we formulate, that many of us formulate and are educating on, is what are the alternatives to petroleum? What are the alternatives to natural gas, to coal, nuclear? And so we get solutions around wind energy, around how do we transform the transmission grid? How do we start to transform the centralized coal facilities that we're using into alternative energy? The transportation infrastructure into electric and hybrid vehicles, and more solar energy. But I would posit, let's try and look at an alternative story. This is one of my favorite authors that many of you may know, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And I really highly recommend you looking her up. She's a Nigerian author. And she did actually an amazing TED Talk that if you have not looked at it, I highly recommend it. And she talks about this concept of the single story and how the single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. And so when we've been sort of looking at climate change, there's been one dominant narrative, which I've just shared with you, around what that story is. Many of the communities that we work with would argue that it's been an incomplete story. And so in order to develop proper education, proper research, and proper, more holistic public policy to meet the challenge of climate change in the next 100 years, we must start to make that story more complete around what is the history of this carbon and what is the history of climate change, so we can develop the right solutions that may not just be technological. And so to do this, what if we put a race and class lens, just as one part of making this story more complete? We have a technological story, let's add race and class and the intersections of that. So if we take the technological sort of starting point of these different facilities and industries that came about, and you start with the wood, right, that we used to sort of start the fueling of industrialization. That was the start of our fossil fuel economy. You had a case in the United States where in 1620 we had largely forested lands, agricultural lands. In 1950 it was significantly less, and by 1920 we had largely deforested most of our country in order to fuel a lot of energy and industrial consumption. At the same time, this was coupled with a lot of Native American policy and a lot of the land grabbing that was happening. Indian land for sale, get a home of your own, find lands in the West. You cannot disconnect our use of the wood resources and the forest resources in this country without a deep analysis of indigenous history and the tribal history that exists within our country. If we were to look at, and I'm going to be pretty provocative here because I feel that we need to start grappling with these issues to really develop sound solutions for climate change. So there's some scholars out there that argue that fossil fuel use and industrialization came at a time that mirrored or overlapped directly with the Emancipation Proclamation in terms of when slavery ended, and what was happening was that as we took that sort of human labor out, we replaced it with fossil fuel energy, fossil fuel labor. And that is what is allowed. There's studies been happening on sort of like what is that intersection. And in some of the earliest coal mines, slave labor was used, and mining practices actually used a lot of practices associated with slavery. As the coal infrastructure started to be established, now over 100 years ago, there's 2 coal plants. Those of you who are from Chicago or have been visiting Chicago, there's a community on the south side of Chicago called Little Village. They have 2 of the oldest coal plants in the country there. They were built in 1903 and 1924, the Fisk and Crawford coal plants. They are located right next to residential, predominantly Mexican, Latino community, where children live, work, and play, and for 100 years have been having a significant impact on health results, asthma, in that community. The electricity was sold to the grid and benefited a lot of the economic growth that other communities benefited from. But the community that was sited right alongside this coal infrastructure was bearing the burden and the impact. So luckily, due to a lot of organizing and work that's happened, these coal plants just shut down a few years ago. But for 100 years, that infrastructure, that fossil fuel climate emitting infrastructure, this is just one story, but many of the coal plants in our country mirror this same sort of demographic pattern. In the 1950s and 60s with the highway expansion, so as we know with the highway expansion, a lot of those highways sort of made the advent of the vehicle, fossil fuel combustion, transportation fuel. And those of you who are new to Minneapolis, you likely, unless you took the light rail, drove down Highway 94. This is a picture of Highway 94 when it was built from the Minnesota History Center. And the siting of that facility, of this highway, which I'm intimately connected to since I live about 3 houses down from it, away from the wall. What the history of it is that it went through largely black neighborhoods when it was built. So the infrastructure development happened in neighborhoods that had very low political capacity to fight back. A lot of them were built, just like the coal plants, were built pre-civil rights movement, and so have a legacy of not taking into consideration a lot of civil rights issues. And so you have the case, not only in Minneapolis, but in many of the cities you all come from, that the highway infrastructure is highly fossil fuel emitting infrastructure, has a legacy, a racial legacy and history. And not everybody benefited from that. And so this is a photo of Americans standing in a food shelf line, and then the imagery that was behind it in terms of who could afford a vehicle and who could start to also afford living in the suburbs. A lot of the post-war urban infrastructure and investments that went there, as you can see, were actually declining in the city and increasing in the metropolitan areas to sort of fuel the suburban sprawl that had a direct white flight, racial implication associated with it. And related to federal housing, FHA loans, that a lot of people of color were not allowed to apply for, that gave access to home ownership in the metropolitan wide area. And with issues such as redlining, a lot of banks did not loan to communities of color to either purchase homes or to even invest in measures for home improvement. This is actually a quote taken from a realtor guidebook from the 60s. So, quote, "A realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood members of any race or nationality, or any individual whose presence will be clearly detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. If a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property should continue to be occupied by the same social and racial groups." This is part of the National Realtors Guidebook and how they would even show property. Now, I mention this because it plays directly into a lot of the housing patterns we see today in our urban core. And why is it that a lot of the homes are inefficient or don't necessarily have the same maintenance? It's because a lot of capital was not allowed to be invested in those communities. And the segregation is still very apparent in Minneapolis as well as in many of the cities across the US. And so this shows the percent growth of population in the city versus outside the city. You can see a decline in population occurring in the city, which are the blue and red. This is Chicago, which is in the blue, and red, which is in Minneapolis, and a high population growth into the suburbs and metropolitan areas. The black line is actually greenhouse gas emissions. So as you had population increase, the increase of the highway system, and the racial segregation that was associated with it due to the policy and financial structures that were accessible by some and not accessible by others, you had a greenhouse gas emissions. So you cannot avoid the conversation of greenhouse gases or devoid the conversation of greenhouse gases from a race class discussion. So in the 1960s, you had a burst of uranium mining and mountaintop removal for coal that was happening. So in terms of uranium mining, a lot of it was happening on indigenous lands, where we actually have the U.S. Forest Service estimates there's still about 1,000 open pit mines that are in the Dakotas, Wyoming, and Montana, I believe that is. And we have the mountaintop removal that many of you are aware of in terms of Appalachia. Now, I know you guys are all thinking, gosh, this is the last session. Don't worry, I'm not just going to depress you. We're going to get back up. But we are working on environmental issues. So these are the stories of that don't get told in a lot of environmental conversations. And during this time was also when the Civil Rights Act and the Clean Air Act was passed. And so what you have is a lot of infrastructure, of our fossil fuel infrastructure, that has been built largely on the backs of communities of color and low-income communities, low-income white communities in the case of Appalachia, and that were committed to and developed, these policies were developed in a pre-civil rights era and before a lot of environmental regulations. So you can even imagine how the extreme health impacts that these communities, the legacy of pollution that exists in a lot of these communities. Richard Nixon actually declared an area up by the Navajo Nation, I believe somewhere in the Dakotas as well, as national sacrifice zones, which were largely on indigenous lands, as a means of saying, well, for our nuclear ambitions, we needed the uranium mining. And so for urban areas or other industries to benefit from that productive energy source, we needed areas to be sacrificed. Unfortunately, those areas were largely indigenous areas in our country. So in the early 1990s, President Clinton signed an environmental justice order to acknowledge this disproportionate burden that communities of color and low-income communities were facing in our country, and that many of our environmental laws actually were not doing such a great job of protecting these communities. And so those of you from Minnesota will recognize Paul Wellstone. They're our former senator, and he was one of the most ardent supporters of environmental justice issues in Congress, and was at the front lines with many environmental justice communities continually in partnership to try and protect community health. And I think that is a vein that runs deep, at least in my work here in Minnesota. And so where are we, 20 years later, since these policies were established? So we had the executive order. This is sort of the national environmental justice policy and law that exists, that governs all the states that you all live in. Executive Order 12898, which is the one I was just referring to, which says that federal action should not have a disproportionate impact on any community, the health of any community. There was an interagency working group established that advised that all agencies, Department of Transportation, Department of Health, develop environmental justice plans for how they would work. There was a National Environmental Justice Advisory Council established that is still there today, that is doing exceptional work and providing guidance on issues around community engagement, research protocols, how you start to instill environmental justice and community efforts into regulatory and policy making. And then we have the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that has been used as a mechanism, albeit a difficult one, to highlight issues of disproportionate impact in terms of tying to federal dollars, where, for example, highways are cited and the impacts of expansion of facilities. So we're still, though, in a place with all these things happening. As an environmental movement, we're still challenged with these. In 1998, in Mossville, Louisiana, Mossville, Louisiana, there's 14 industrial facilities in Mossville, Louisiana. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Mossville, but it was a town that was established by freed slaves. There wasn't that much industry there until, I believe, the 1930s. And then systematically, this area started to get a significant number of industrial and chemical facilities. There's a movie that was made, Black Vinyl, I believe, around it, that you can start to get educated around it. But this area has estimated, the small community has, EPA has estimated that the chemical toxins are 100 times the national standard that are there. The community has, it's a Black community, has tried every mechanism in state and federal court to try and get remediation and mitigation for this highly toxic environment that's been created. There is no recourse because every single facility that's located in Mossville, Louisiana is completely legal, individually. Because the way our policy making is constructed, one facility has the right to emit at a certain national standard, right? It does not account for the fact of cumulative impact. So it does not account for the fact of multiple facilities. So each singular facility has the right and is permitted to emit a certain level. But if they're all in one area, that neighborhood is essentially experiencing a high cumulative impact, right? And so they've had to go to international court to try and get recourse. So these are just some of the images coming out of Mossville. And this is an image from the Chevron facility in Richmond, California, one of the largest refineries in our country that's located in a Latino area. as well. And in just 2 or 3 years ago, this was an explosion that happened that sent 15,000 residents to the hospital for exposure. It's located right next to the community. So, and then here we are in very recently, and Julian Marshall, who is at the University of Minnesota here, is doing some great research, came out with a study in 2014 on national patterns in environmental justice and inequality, and looking at people of color are still exposed to 46% more nitrogen dioxide pollution each year than white people. And nitrogen dioxide pollution comes from our cars and trucks and our power plants, results in health issues such as chronic lung issues, heart disease. In Minnesota, where we are today, people of color are exposed to about 45% more NOx than whites. And in the Twin Cities, where we're located, non-whites are exposed to 18% more than whites. So the disparities still exist. So what does that mean now for our community and sustainability moving forward? So I would say one really important area of research and education that we need to be focusing on is this assessment of cumulative impacts. What does that look like for communities that are overburdened? How are we starting to understand these concepts? How are we starting to think about issues of cumulative risk for a community that is experiencing them? Because most of these communities that are low-income communities of color, it's not just the environmental pollution that is impacting them, it's the stress factors. There's other stress factors associated with either not having access to health care or working multiple jobs, not having access to daycare, those kinds of issues. And then in terms of cumulative exposures related to these multiple facilities I was talking about, and then cumulative impacts. How does that result in cumulative impacts? The methodology around this is very minimal currently. The Minnesota Pollution Control Agency is starting to do some cumulative impact assessment analyses, but it is the $60,000 question in terms of sort of cutting edge research for environmental justice, and how do we start to train our next generation of students and leaders that are going to be working in government to try and understand how these different elements start to intersect, because these are the challenges we're facing. We cannot just look at carbon pollution in isolation. There's a lot of other things that come out of the stack. There's a lot of other pollution that is being impacted in community health. People are receiving them differently. It's much more complex. And so our future environmental policy has to start to address that complexity. This is an image of Minneapolis, and we are located, you can see kind of the downtown central area of the buildings right there. This is a map that is developed, released by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency that starts to look at cumulative impact, that starts to look at, it's a model that starts to look at multiple receptors and air monitors compiling multiple access data points to start to estimate what is the cumulative potential cancer risk of a certain location. And so those redder areas are the areas in our great city that have a higher risk of air pollution. And so I can't really, it's too big for me to really point out where I live. I live in kind of one of the higher little red areas. But what you'll notice is because Minneapolis is also very segregated, most of the higher pollution toxic areas are where there's more people of color in our cities. And it's also mirrors directly with a lot of the industrial and zoning areas in our city. So this to me is, as we start to think about, like, okay, well, so this is where there's higher cancer risk in our city. So the city of Minneapolis, very excitingly, is, in the metropolitan area in general, is starting to develop their comprehensive plans, their city comprehensive plans that are going to be governing planning and development and zoning for the next 10 years. So how do we start to integrate issues of cumulative health impacts into land use planning, into our comprehensive plannings? How do we start to do that? How do we start to look at where where the bad stuff is and also where the good stuff is going. Where's the green infrastructure going? Where's the tree canopy going, which we know has a lot of amazing health benefits in terms of infrastructure for air pollution and for creating more climate resiliency? How do we start to look at these latest analyses that are coming out on cumulative impact to start to really think about the future of land use planning in our cities so that we can start to transition these hotspots into sustainability areas that are largely right now, most of these hotspots on this map are kind of missing out on a lot of the amazing sustainability work that, that many of us are involved with. A lot of the energy resources dollars, energy efficiency dollars, solar dollars are largely bypassing many of these communities. So to give you an example, this was in Minneapolis, this was SEED has developed an environmental justice mapping tool that starts to layer a lot of the environmental data across different state and local agencies. And how does that pan out? So we picked two neighborhoods in Minneapolis. So we call this the tale of two neighborhoods. And so in neighborhood A, you have a population density of 11 people per acre. Neighborhood B, 3 people acre, so higher density in neighborhood A. Neighborhood A has 75% people of color. Neighborhood B has 10% or less. So neighborhood A, that was higher density and more people of color in Minneapolis, had approximately 44 contaminated sites allotted by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. Neighborhood B had 8. In terms of existing tree canopy, neighborhood A had 3.8% tree canopy, and neighborhood B at 42%. And in terms of access to public parks, neighborhood A had 6.4 acres of parkland within 9 minutes walking area, and neighborhood B had 280. Now, I say this because there are inequities in terms of our environmental infrastructure that exists right now, in terms of who's borne the burden of a lot of our environmental problems historically, and also today in terms of our urban planning. And I really like this quote by former US EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson, who in an interview said, "It's very much American central view that clean air, clean land, and clean water are their rights. But you can't say that and in the same sentence not say that it's all Americans' rights." That is the foundation of how the environmental justice movement sees environmental work moving forward. It's not about not in my backyard. It's not about just moving it around. But how do we once start to address that certain communities have borne a disproportionate impact of our development patterns? And how do we start to plan that moving forward? And in the long term, start to develop solutions so that nobody has to have these in their backyard. Because studies have shown that communities did not move to these areas just because they were low income. Race has actually been a higher determinant factor than income in terms of these facility sightings. And so you have cases where communities have already been there and these facilities have been cited for the very reasons I was talking about before, where there's low political capacity to engage, and environmental and regulatory policies do not take into consideration the realities of that community. So this is another quote by another amazing woman, Walida Imarishi. I'm going to say her name wrong, Imarisha. She just came out with a book on social justice and science fiction. Social justice and science fiction. It's called Octavia's Brood. Highly recommend it. And I think it engages in a lot of what we're also involved with in the sustainability world, right? How do we start to envision this alternative reality? It is science fiction, right? For right now, that's what we're all engaged in. It's sort of this act of science fiction. What does this look like? And she says that anytime we try to envision a different world without poverty, prisons, war, we are engaging in science fiction. when we can dream those realities together, that's how we can begin to build them right here and now. And so we are at a time, this is an image of our energy infrastructure. It's a crazy image, I won't get into it, but it's all the natural gas, coal, transmission lines, all the infrastructure that exists from the Department of Energy in our country that need to transform if we're going to address some of our most pressing environmental, energy, and climate goals. The energy investments are very out of balance, right, in terms of the amount of money that the world's top energy corporations get, which is $2.1 trillion, versus the budget in blue of the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, the US Department of Energy, which is $3 billion, right? These are huge sort of challenges. So we have to engage in sort of a very transformational visioning process that acknowledges that the way we've done things in the past have created a lot of not just environmental, but social problems that we're seeing currently in our society. So how do we really start to envision the future? And a lot of the knowledge that exists is, and the way we approach our work, is that sort of this term of a lot of the frontline communities that have been on the front lines of the fossil fuel infrastructure and have been on the front lines of these environmental problems have an immense amount of knowledge about these facilities. They live them day in and day out. They know exactly which policy levers and which government institutions are responsible, what the health impacts are. And by tapping into their expertise, this lived on-the-ground knowledge of generational expertise in many of their cases that have been there for generations, there's actually an amazing amount of expertise existence there that we have not tapped because there haven't been the resources. And I know many of you have been looking at this three-legged sustainability stool. I know it's been a big part of this conference. And I think we have mastered sort of environmental management and economic growth, right? Like how do we start to look at those two and develop the analytical measures for that? The part we struggle with is the social leg, right? How do we start to develop those analytical tools? And I think that's the exciting part now of how do we start to operationalize equity and how do we start to give the tools of how do you actually measure it, right? That's what I find is in the policy world. People are asking, how do you actually measure it? That's really where things are moving forward. And how do we start to more intentionally integrate this social justice and social equity metrics that really look at how you integrate all three of these things? Because right now, what's happening is that we are so heavy on the environment and economic piece that it's actually to the detriment of the social piece. And I say that as an example even with solar panel production, right? How many of us actually know what the labor practices are that are happening with the solar panel productions? How much do we know about the extraction of the minerals that is happening with a lot of the technologies we're promoting in terms of lithium batteries? Where is that lithium batteries coming from? Is it on indigenous land? What are these other social attributes, the technologies that we're promoting? How do we start to develop practices and means of tracking and understanding that how do we really push a three-legged stool forward and not be so heavy just on the environment and economic pieces? The Minneapolis Climate Action Plan, which was something that we were involved heavily in, which we're very proud of. Minneapolis is actually one of the only cities in the country, besides Oakland, California, that has such a strong environmental justice lens to their climate action plan. And I bring that up also because it was not easy to instill that within the Minneapolis Climate Action Plan. It took a lot of hard work. It took almost a year for environmental justice communities, which are the communities of color in Minneapolis, to even get a seat at the table. Considering half of the city are people of color, when the Minneapolis Climate Action Plan process started, there was maybe one person of color out of like 100 or so people involved in the working group. And I think that's kind of symbolic of a lot of the policy and planning efforts that move forward. And so there was a lot of push to get an environmental justice working group established, and I feel it was very successful in terms of putting recommendations forward that were place-based, that acknowledged geographic disparity, that looked at co-health benefits associated with carbon reduction, looked at the targeting of smaller users of energy for renters and low-income populations, and benefiting of green policies across demographics. And what's amazing is this climate action plan passed the City Council with votes that normally may not have supported the climate action plan, because it had integrated the social piece so much better than earlier it had. And so now we're in a process of trying to move some of the policies forward, but I don't want to negate the effort, sort of the unseen part that the community had to play to really educate our policymakers, right? And sort of turn the narrative and provide the science and the research. What kind of access do community members have to research right now? It's very minimal. There's not much trust with a lot of universities. They've been studied for a long time. There's not many bridge nonprofits that exist to sort of help with that. And that's another area that we need to start building up. One is the trust between academia and a lot of communities of color that have been overstudied. And a lot of students come and leave. And so how do we really start to build that trust again and build up sort of the NGO sector too that can start to be a bridge between academia and a lot of community groups? Because I think this effort really relied on that. It was co-facilitated, and a lot of research support was given by SEED and other research organizations that focus on climate. And another piece is that in a lot of these situations is that many low-income and communities of color are not well-resourced to be at the table in a lot of planning efforts and a lot of community efforts. And so this was a study that was done by the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, and that shows that in terms of how much money of environmental funding, so those of you that intersect with the NGO sector, from 2007 to 2009, only 15% of environmental funding went to marginalized communities. So it is highly under-resourced, and it's part of the reason that we see a lot of the disparities and a lot of the tables that we try and set up and try and be inclusive, but there isn't any support to that person sitting at the table. There's no research support. They come to a lot of tables and very analytical. The things we work on are very analytical, can get very analytical very quickly. And so you're not going to get long-term engagement of community members or community groups unless they have the backing and support of researchers and analysts that they trust, that they know come from a racial and economic justice lens, to really help answer their questions so they can be equal partners at the table. And that is a key area we need to be moving forward on. And so in terms of defining the environmental injustice problem moving forward, are we going to be thinking about sort of, as I've talked about the fossil fuel industry in terms of reinforcing violence or building democracy? Are we going to be thinking about politics in terms of promoting the pollution environmental industrial complex, sort of what we saw and what we're seeing in Mossville? And in terms of policy, are we going to sort of keep mirroring this technological kind of approach to our environmental problems in sort of what I would consider kind of a stagnated way? Or are we going to start being innovative and really starting to intersect these other social issues, the other social sciences, into how we look at environmental issues moving forward? So one of the ways that has been happening is an initiative called the Green Zones Initiative that has been very popular in, is moving very aggressively in Los Angeles, that is really looking at targeting communities for resources that targets overburdened communities. I encourage you all to look it up. Minneapolis is going to be moving forward with it as well. It is in the Climate Action Plan, and the City Council is considering a resolution, hopefully in the very near future, on moving this forward. It utilizes a place-based framework and directs coordinated diverse resources toward place-based planning and policy, so that we can start to have an organized transition from hotspot to sustainability. This effort that was undertaken in LA, this is an innovative policy that's been put forward by a lot of environmental justice communities, required a really close partnership with universities, academics, and students. There was extensive mapping done, there was extensive ground truthing done, and it was only because there was such a strong partnership between that academic center and communities on the ground, that this has really been a solid partnership moving forward. And I just want to end with sort of thinking about how we move forward in our framing around environmental issues. How do we start to center it around these issues of human rights, the commons, a just transition, looking at energy services, self-determination, questions of governance, scale, reclaiming our relationship to the earth, the rights of nature, and repairing harm. These are principles that have been put forward by the Climate Justice Alliance, which is an alliance of, that is connected to hundreds of grassroots frontline organizations that have borne this legacy of pollution in our country. And their frame for moving, our frame for moving forward is really how do we start to integrate all these into future policy and planning issues. And each of these is going to require rethinking of, considering the magnitude of our problems, it's going to require an equal magnitude of solution building. What is the legal research associated with this? What is the on-the-ground legal advocacy associated with this? What is the data analysis associated with this? And so it's going to require a lot of us to come together to really try and put this vision forward and move it forward. I'd just like to end with a quote from Arundhati Roy, who is from Kerala, India. I'm from North India. And she says that another world is not only possible, she's on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. So thank you very much.
So much.
Yeah. Can we take questions? Or no?
Are you doing questions or no?
It's up to you. Okay, if there's any questions, I think we have a little bit of time. If there's microphones, if people have any questions or comments.
I'm a little confused by your statement that we've got the environment and the growth economics solved. A fairly well-known economist is quoted as saying, in order to believe you can have a growth economy inside a finite planet, you either have to be stupid or an economist. I don't know why people aren't talking about that.
Well, I completely agree with you, and I would say that it was, that's why the integration of social justice needs to be integrated in. My comment on that was that so much of our resources and energy and thinking has gone into sort of thinking about how do we look at the environmental and economic growth planning around it. Whereas by leaving the social justice pieces out of it, you actually result in not acceptable solutions. And so the amount of energy that we've spent on those two legs, we need to also spend on the social piece.
I don't disagree with you there. I'm just wondering why everybody isn't out here realizing that a zero growth economy is absolutely essential, or nothing else is moving forward anyway.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello, thank you for your conference. My name is Carlos from Colombia, Universidad AASHE. I totally agree with what you said, and I would love to see in that final graph, and that's part of my comment question, is something that, I also said in another session, is why everybody is talking about the environmental crisis, corruption crisis, but no, well, a few are talking about social crisis. And you talk about race, and you little mention about the solar panels, how they are being produced. And worldwide surveys, Gallup 2013, Deloitte 2015, 86% of workers, they hate their work. 86%. Why is nobody talking about that? That's a social epidemic. And there is sufficient research that shows correlation with family violence, depression, frustration. And if I said that, as I said in the session, 8 out of 10 of you hate your work. And nobody said anything. So I am with you that we need to put we need to have a holistic vision. That's sustainability. So we are all sustainable. And just the final thing is, I would love to see the statistics, the demographics of the people registered in this session, just to go to your, because I see a lot of women. Why sustainability is a womenish position. There's something about that. So thank you.
Thank you. Oh, should we go to that side and then we'll,
Yeah. Full disclosure, I'm an economist, so let's get that out of the way. So, one particular point I want to stress is that a lot of people here have jobs that didn't exist 15 years ago, 20 years ago, right? That is a form of economic growth, right? But it is an economic growth in a way that is pointing us towards the right direction, right? We need a lot of investment dollars to make a lot of the required changes we're talking here. We need proper governance, we need proper political structure, which we don't have, I completely agree with. But in order to have investment, we have to have savings. And the only way we get savings is through some form of economic growth. So I get a little concerned, aside from being called, relatively stupid, that there's this idea that we can make investments without having money to make the investments. And I just would caution us a little bit from picking the peripheries instead of the sort of middle ground. And I think the presentation was fantastic. And one thing it pointed out was that we've created a tremendous amount of economic growth and relative prosperity, right? For this year, for the first time ever, global poverty rates are below 10%, for the first time ever. And markets had a lot to do with that, right? Markets also cause a lot of problems. A lot of those problems come from, as she pointed out, governance problems, policy problems, an inability to focus on the social structure. So that's sort of my piece there. My one question I have for you would be, I'm a public finance economist, environmental economist, so I look a lot at policies and how they produce outcomes. And one of the things I find is that not only do the policies that we have not produce the outcomes we want, they're not even the outcomes that voters want, right? So there's this sort of marginalization of the voter. So aside from just the cliched getting money out of politics, what do you think from a social perspective, and specifically those that are at the bottom of the relative income scales, what do you think they can do, sort of on their own, because it seems like that's kind of what society sort of is expecting. What can those folks do to sort of empower themselves and really start being voices to make this work a little bit better?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's happening considerably. And I think what we're seeing is some of the most creative and innovative solutions to climate change that actually shutting down a lot of these fossil fuel infrastructure has actually come from the grassroots communities. If you think about the millions of dollars that were spent on environmental and climate legislation in the past when cap and trade was first moving forward, just an enormous amount of money on a policy mechanism that failed a few years ago. And then you also have situations like that happening over and over again. But what you have is still these facilities being shut down due to a lot of market drivers, but you also have a lot of consistent frontline community engagement that's been there, not on an annual sort of transactional basis, but thinking about transformational politics, right? Thinking about long-term politics. A lot of the resources have gone to what we talk about transactional politics, right? Like how do you move the legislature in 1 year? How do you move Congress in certain districts? Engagement in certain districts has been sort of on a transactional basis. But environmental justice communities and communities of the ground are thinking about not transactional politics, but transformational politics. How does a win, how is what you're doing now set you up, not for a good deal this year, but for an even better deal in 5 years. And that's how a lot of communities on the ground really think about political engagement.
Charles Allison from the New School in New York City. 5 or 7 years ago, Minnesota was out in the forefront to try and decrease harmful emissions from diesel fuel and heating oil by requiring that biodiesel be used, a blend of biofuels and traditional diesel. Do you have any updates on whether that had any effect on reducing SOx and NOx, especially because of bus emissions, trains, and especially in underserved neighborhoods?
Right, that's a great question. I just want to say my colleague is going to be at the New School, Dr. Cecilia Martinez. She and a few other researchers were invited by Michelle DePass to do a panel and some papers on the Clean Power Plan. And so she's going to be speaking on Thursday. So yeah, so if you're back there, yeah. You know, I'm actually not familiar with some of the immediate impacts around it. There is a Clean Air Minnesota endeavor that is probably monitoring that. I know there's a lot of planning happening right now in terms of us being able to meet the new ozone standards. And I imagine there have been some local reductions in terms of underserved communities. But I think where it hasn't impacted as much is in construction vehicles. And in some of the environmental justice communities, like in Phillips, that's here in Minneapolis, the diesel pollution from trucks is a little harder because we can't necessarily require that transformation to happen. And so the pollution burden, which is linked directly to some of the zoning and land use maps, is still quite high. So I think while some of the school buses and some of the sort of construction vehicles have been changed over, the hard ones are really the diesel trucks that are really moving through our neighborhoods in these industrial areas. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And it sounds like there were some people behind me that were also hoping to thank you. My question is two-pronged and gets kind of large, but I'm wondering, and you just started to get to it, about if you know of any models of sort of intercity, intercounty, intergovernmental, and community work on some of this stuff. Where I live in Boulder, it's got a really strong climate action plan, but isn't doing anything with the bedroom communities because it's so unaffordable. It's crazy expensive to live there. So a lot of the emissions are actually coming from all the commuting, but there's not a lot of dialogue with the other communities in the area. And I also kind of want to throw in something about COP21, because that's supposed to be that on a global scale, but wonder if there's any more cooperative models that you know.
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a few, I mean, here in the Twin Cities, we have a Metropolitan Council. Sort of at a time the cities actually share resources. And so I think there's probably people in this room that know much more about that, but it has sort of helped in increased investments in the urban core where it may not have been possible prior, but I think there's still a lot of challenges associated with that. But that's a good question. And definitely the COP is coming up. There's actually a huge contingency of climate justice advocates that's going to be present. I don't know if many of you saw the New York Climate March that happened sort of leading up to the climate negotiations. And so in terms of at least some of the grassroots organizing that's happening around it, that is quite distant, obviously, from the international negotiations. But we strongly believe that ultimately whatever is decided internationally, it has to result in on-the-ground reductions, right? So a lot of focus on the international negotiations actually, at least in my experience, has sort of made it more difficult for communities on the ground to really engage with it. It feels like it's, you know, out of our control, out of people's control, and so what can I do? I just need to wait for them to figure it out, when it's actually totally flipped, right? The more we do locally, the more political capital is built for actually our states and country being more, us pushing them to be more powerful and more direct in these negotiations internationally. Otherwise, there's just going to be a momentum to water it down. So we're always advocating for, we actually need to be investing in a lot of local solutions across the board that have scale, because these are happening all over. And so how do we then build that momentum to then push for stronger state, federal, international legislation rather than the other way around. Thank you so much.